Here we go. Well, good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you on our bookshelf edition of the Coffee Break at JSCN. We've got a lovely crowd of people in this morning. Nice to see Arnold and Joe as well. I can see some new names there. If you'd just like to leave yourselves on mute, I'm sure that just in case there's some unexpected distractions, that would be handy. And I might be letting some people, admitting people into the room as the talk goes on. So welcome to you, and welcome especially to our special guest, Pam Fox. Morning, Pam.
Morning. Very blustery on the south coast.
I think it's going to be blustery everywhere. I don't know which direction the storm is coming from, but we all seem to be getting it one way or another. Now then, Pam, maybe you don't need introduction to a number of people because they probably come because they know your name or have read your previous books, but you've had lots of writings in the past, looking at the history of places and looking, in this case, at the history of well, the illustrious history, I suppose you could say, of the Bournemouth hotels and guest houses, and particularly those really where all the Jewish population, wherever they were in the country, they came from the north of England, they came from London, from everywhere to holiday in Bournemouth. So it's in many people's memories from their childhood or when they took their kids there. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the background to those hotels, and really, I suppose, the background to the book?
Right. I just want to give about 5 minutes overview of the hotels when they started and the history after that. I managed to trace back the very first Jewish establishments to the late 19th century. The very first Jewish guest house was something called a Lundy, which was opened in West Hill in Bournemouth in 1892, and it was very quickly followed by a number of other establishments in the area. But it really wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that there was a flurry of establishments. When they first arrived, they were called boarding houses, and they're quite basic. But by the beginning of the 20th century, they changed their names to guest houses rather than as boarding houses. And they become a lot more comfortable, a lot more luxurious, and they were attracting people and guest house owners from all over the country where Jews had previously been. They had a lot more facilities, and they were a lot more attractive than they had been previously. But the big spurt of growth didn't really start to happen until after the First World War, when you started to get for the first time Jewish establishments that called themselves hotels rather than guest houses. And the one which is really significant was something called Eastcliff Court, which opened in 1926, which really was the sign of things to come. These hotels became ever more luxurious, and what was interesting from a research point of view was just how much competition there was at this time between them. That in their advertisements, they were full of superlatives, the best, the biggest, the most luxurious, the most comfortable, etc. And they were constantly closing to renovate and to expand themselves. It was a huge competitive era. The stage was really set for what was to come in the post-war years in the 1930s, which saw the opening of 3 very large hotels: Eastcliff Manor, the Ambassador Hotel, which was the first purpose-built kosher hotel, and also during the war years itself, the Green Park Hotel. They really did demonstrate what was to come. And the numbers that came in behind them was really quite remarkable, given that this was in the middle of depression, but new establishments were opening. There was a bit of a lull during the Second World War when a lot of the hotels, including the Jewish ones, were requisitioned for war purposes, for accommodation, for use as social places for the army personnel and so on, including the Ambassador in Eastcliff Court. But just as the war ended, the whole scene changed. Bursting onto scene were the hotels which became known as the Big Eight. So already established before the war were Eastcliff Court, Eastcliff Manor, the Green Park and the Ambassador, but they're very quickly joined by the Normandy, the Langham, the Majestic and the Cumberland. And together they became known as the Big Eight. And they really dominated Jewish holiday making for the next 25, 30 years. They really outshone the non-Jewish hotels in Bournemouth. And they were epitomised by their glamour, by the quality of the service and by the facilities that they offered. But they were not alone. There are also a whole network of other kosher establishments, guest houses and smaller hotels. Some of them came and went quite quickly, but others endured. But they were, at any one time, there were about 20 smaller establishments. And I think this is quite an important point. There was something for everybody, not just the Big Eight, but across the spectrum. The decline of the kosher establishments really became evident at the beginning of the 1960s. Some of this was about cheap travel, the package holidays, the cheap airfares, but there was also some quite important Jewish reasons for the decline as well, such as the rise in holiday making in Israel after the Six-Day War, the fact that people, the kosher, providing kosher and kashrut was now becoming a lot more expensive and they weren't competitive anymore, etc. And what we saw from the 1960s onwards was a closing down of what had been long-term establishments and a changing of the holiday scene from living in hotels and guest houses to more self-catering, people either renting or buying their own apartments. And that's continued to today. The bulk of Jewish holiday making in Bournemouth is still self-catering. There are only 2 kosher establishments. The Normandy, which surprisingly survived from way back in the post-war years, though it's a bit of a shadow of its former self, and the Water Garden, which opened in 2005. So that's my quick whiz through an overview of the development, decline and change in the Jewish holiday offering in Bournemouth. And it's really over to you and everybody else to ask questions.
Yeah, well, let me remind people to put questions in the chat as they think of them. It's a note if it comes up later on, or I can pull it up if it's something that we're talking about. But what I wanted to ask you about, I mean, what you've described there is a fairly linear sort of rise and decline. But were there any surprises that you found whilst you were looking into these hotels and guest houses?
There were. The biggest surprise about the hotels was just how much people could eat. We all know that eating is a central tenet of Jewish life, but I was just amazed when I looked at the menus and heard people's memories of staying in the hotels about the non-stop meals. People seem to segue seamlessly between one multi-course meal and the next, and it seemed almost as if even when people weren't eating, they were either sleeping off the meals or talking about food. And it did go on almost sort of a 24/7 eat-a-thon, because people also told me about late night buffets for people who couldn't survive to breakfast the next morning. And each of the hotels had their specialities, like sausages late at night.
We all like an all-night buffet. Come on.
So that was one thing, just how much people could eat, particularly people telling me stories about the Shabbat Kedushim, huge groaning tables just an hour prior to the four-course lunch on Saturday. The other things that surprised me were these. Just the amount of nostalgia that surrounds us and still surrounds the hotels. It seemed like in Bournemouth, the sun always shone, and people thought those days would never end. And people still talk with such warmth about the hotels and guest houses. And a lot of people I spoke with told me that they still go back to Bournemouth to relive the times that they spent there. They go either for a day or for a weekend, just to rekindle their memories. So then nostalgia was really something. And just the third thing about what came as a surprise was how big a phenomenon the hotels were. They were kind of the nexus of Jewish holiday life. People lived for their holiday in Bournemouth. It was the big event of the year. And it was a very kind of a thing about almost a social, a sign of social status. You weren't anyone unless you went for a holiday in Bournemouth. And I don't think I'd realised before I started writing just how huge these were in Anglo-Jewish life. Yeah.
So we've got a couple of questions we're already coming up here, and one which I think is going to relate to some backstories that we're going to talk to. So maybe I'll just hang on to that one for a moment. But Marion's saying, how upfront were these hotels in publicizing that they were Jewish? I mean, we're talking probably in people's memories post-war. So we're thinking, well, you know, there isn't so much anti-Semitism, people against us. Perhaps people are a little more sensitive these days, but were they completely Jewish clients going to these hotels? And, you know, did they just publicize themselves to the whole world as this is the way you come for a Jewish holiday?
To try and remember all those different bits of the questions, they did advertise. But they advertised mainly in Jewish arena. So the Jewish Chronicle was full of adverts for the Jewish hotels in Bournemouth, but also back in the kind of places that Jews lived in those days. I mean, there were lots of adverts for the hotels in Yiddish, even in the East End of London. I came across some lovely Yiddish advertisements for the hotels. So I think they were not disguising the fact they were Jewish, but they were advertising in Jewish media. Your second question was about how Jews came to be there. It was, although they advertised, there was very much a word of mouth process as well. As we all know, Jews tend to be a bit tribal, and where one Jewish person goes, others follow them. And once it became known that Bournemouth was the place to be, then the other Jews piled in as well. It was sort of that kind of process.
I would guess it must have been a surprise if you booked there and you weren't Jewish.
Yeah, you asked about whether the clients were all Jewish. I think it was about 99.9% were, but there were some non-Jews who went, perhaps because they knew the owners or because they knew the guests as well. But they were principally Jewish places.
And are we talking about traditional Jewish families, or are we talking about the whole spectrum? Are we talking about Haredim, or just who are the clients?
Yeah, there are two things to say about that. the people who didn't go actually to the hotels were the old established Jewish families. So what we sometimes call the cousinhood, the people who'd been in the country for many centuries, the Goldsmiths or the Montefiore's, etc. These hotels were not for them. We hardly saw those families. They were mainly the people who'd come as immigrants during the late 19th century, early 20th century, and had made it to be able to afford to stay in a hotel. Yeah, those are the principal customers of the hotels.
And what were the aspects of Jewish life there? I mean, you sort of talked about the food. Yeah. Were there other things that went on, entertainment?
Yeah. Religion was an integral part of life in the hotels. They did vary in terms of how from they were, how religious they were. For example, the Green Park was recognised as being a lot more orthodox than some of the other hotels. But nevertheless, they all had religion in some form. I don't know that people realise that the larger hotels, not just the big 8, had their own dedicated synagogues where people could worship, both on Shabbat and for the festivals and holy days as well. And the larger ones also had their own shoma. The shoma was very kind of a prominent person in the hotel, as well as the owners. Some of them were great characters, and a lot of them became quite loved and part of the hotel scene. It was quite a sinecure to become a showman in a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth after a long career, either as a hazan or a minister. It was a good thing to be able to get a job as a showman in a hotel.
Are any of those remembered by name, or did they just fade into history?
No, people might mention someone called Fenigstein, who was the long-standing showman at the Normandy. There were people like Louis Wyatt, who was the showman at the Cumberland for quite a while. People like what are the other ones? Not offhand, but they were well-known characters. Do other people remember any of the shoma at the hotels?
If anybody does, I mean, Morris is saying Reverend Commissar.
Yeah, Commissar. Yeah, he was at I think he was at the ambassador. Am I right? The ambassador.
And well, there's a question about the ambassador. When did the ambassador become the new ambassador?
During the 1960s. The ambassador had a bit of a checkered history, actually, because just after the war, unlike the other hotels, which were mainly family-owned and run, the ambassador was run by a consortium of people, including some non-Jewish people. But in the 1960s, it was purchased by a Jewish family, actually the same people that had an interest in the Normandy, and they changed the name from being the ambassador to the new ambassador.
Right, okay. And somebody's mentioning the name Wolfson. I'm not sure whether that's another
Wolfson, he was a showman, yeah.
Yeah.
He was at the Green Park. Yeah.
Quite a few people are saying that their families either lived or they always holidayed there. One says, especially for Pesach. Well, that's something which goes on now, isn't it?
I think there was quite a pattern that in the summer it was mainly families with young people. At the festivals, it tended to be the more religious people, and actually probably the more wealthy people, because it was quite expensive to go to the hotels for the festivals. And then during the winter, perhaps more popular with older people because of the mild climate.
Yeah, well, it's always expensive to go to a hotel for Pesach with the festivals, isn't it? It's like trying to get a flight to Israel. That's always expensive. Jerry Crest says his wife's family owned the Splendid in Boston.
Yes.
And he was friendly with Bloomer and Jeffrey Feld.
Let's mention Splendid because it's really quite interesting. So it was run by a a man called Lou Simmons, I think his name was, and he was actually a musician but blind as well. And he turned from his career to running the Hotel Splendid. Even though he was blind, he did a lot of the work himself in the hotel. I don't know if people have memories of staying in the Splendid.
Well, if you do, I mean, people are putting their memories down here. It's but carry on doing so. If anybody wants to chip in and tell their own sort of remembrance, what they remember of holidays there or family connections, just put your hand up, either your virtual hand or your actual hand, and well, I'll see whether I can call you in. So let's see what else. You talked about the decline, and we've talked about some of the different aspects of it. I mean, I've got a little note here. It's something which was in the summary of the book, and maybe you can take this a little bit further. But there's a note talking about, you've written about the legacies of these kosher establishments, how that illuminates hopes and achievements and perhaps even some sorrows. Were there hopes and achievements in the stories behind the guests and owners?
The legacies of the hotels were absolutely enormous. I actually wrote about, I don't know, 20 pages about the legacies. The legacies, as I recall them, the largest ones were about sustaining the community. How I came to write the book in the first place was in the process of writing other books. People said, and I met my partner, or I met my husband, I met my wife when I stayed in a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth. And a big thing was actually people went there to find a partner, and because of the marriages that came out of staying in the hotels, it actually helped to sustain the Jewish community rather than marrying out. A lot of people stayed within the faith and produced future generations of Jewish people. The other way in which the hotels sustained the community was the contribution it made to Jewish life in Bournemouth. A lot of people who'd stayed in the Jewish hotels actually later went to live in Bournemouth. So there was a kind of topping up effect for many decades after the big hotels disappeared. Another legacy was around what I'd call Jewish continuity. I've just mentioned the religious dimension of the hotels, and a lot of people who had perhaps already lapsed in their Judaism or were not very observant, actually as a result of going to the hotels, rekindled their faith. A lot of people, particularly young people, learnt to daven in the hotels, and they learnt about their religion there. So there's this big contribution to Jewish continuity. The other thing I think that they were really notable for was the way in which they enabled assimilation to wider society. I think there's a kind of myth that Jewish assimilation was done and dusted by 1945, but actually I discovered that there was still a way to go in terms of people becoming assimilated, and the hotels played a really prominent role in helping people to make that transition from being an immigrant into being part of the mainstream life. They were places that they could go to feel comfortable, to feel safe, and to practice some of the new ways of life that they were acquiring. Therefore, their legacy was really strong. And one which I must mention, a few years ago when I wrote about the Jewish community of Golders Green, I got quite a poor review on Amazon. Somebody gave me just 1 star because I hadn't mentioned football at all in the book. So in this context of legacy, I must mention that a lot of people did and still support Bournemouth AFC because they stayed in a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth.
That's a tick on that box. But you were mentioning assimilation. I mean, we think of assimilation in terms of diluting the Jewish community.
Mm.
But to me, it sounds that you're talking about integration into the wider community, from being immigrants and closed inward looking to being, going on holiday and being exposed to the seaside environment in general, whilst being in the comfort of a Jewish community in the hotel. So which way do you mean?
It's more about integration. I think what the hotels really helped to do was to make people feel comfortable with their Jewish identity and kind of confident enough to participate in British life on their own terms. I think what I discovered, it was quite significant that compared to Jewish identity in other countries, there's much more of this sort of twin tracking of being kind of Yiddish on one part, but being British on the other. And when I compared it to America and kind of continental communities, there was much more kind of comfort of being that kind of twin track type of identity.
Yes, I think sort of there are many Jews, especially around the early part of the 20th century, maybe the late 19th, who felt very strongly about, adopting their Britishness. And I know in the We Were There Too project, there's one example when there was the call to arms for the First World War. The Jewish community made the leaders of the Jewish community, I'm not sure whether it came from the Board of Deputies, but certainly the leadership in general of the national community, really started putting posters around, to the effect of, Britain has supported us in coming to this country and enabling us to start new lives. We should support the country. Every Jew is expected to do his duty and go and fight in the First World War for the Brits, for Britain. So yes, I think that was a strong feeling. But going back to characters for a moment, and whilst you're talking about that, I can see that the questions are piling in there. But thinking about characters, we talked about the guests, and we talked about the characters of the showmers there. Were there other characters who came from the staff, and are there any more owners that maybe really sort of come to light?
There's two groups of people that I'd like to mention. First of all, the people that I call the Grand Dame of Bournemouth. These are the really powerful women that had such a prominent role in running many of the hotels. So this is the Blumenfeld, the Faye Schneider, the Belle Keane, of Bournemouth. They were amazing, just for their skill, their knowledge of the hospitality trade, but they were just such powerful characters. And I'd like at some stage to write an article capturing their contribution and their personalities. I mean, they were such strong personalities. The other thing was that when people talk about the holiday and trade in Bournemouth, they do tend to think about first the big 8 hotels. But when I researched the other smaller hotels and the guest houses, I discovered that there were some real personalities running these smaller places, like Mr. Rivlin.
Who was he?
The Grosvenor Court Hotel, I think it was, that he ran. He was an Israeli, and all accounts describe it as something of a bit of a gambling den, and he was really quite well known in Bournemouth. There was the Gutstein family who ran the Carmel Hotel. In the days when the Jewish community was kind of mainly middle of the road orthodoxy, the Gutstein's Hotel was very, very Haredi. Guests there wore streimels on Shabbat, and the services that took place there were were very orthodox, and it rather stuck out. But I think the point that I wanted to make is that almost the characters of the people that ran the smaller guest houses was more evident than in the bigger hotels. They very much kind of dominated the character of the smaller places. Very interestingly, I came across a little grouping of guest houses that were run by former refugees, people who'd come across to the UK during the 1930s and escaping Nazism. And some of them moved from London to set up little guest houses in Bournemouth. There was one called the Continental, the Simha was another. One run by the Broder family were another, but they had a very distinct German atmosphere, continental atmosphere. It was continental food, German was spoken. They're meant to be a kind of safe haven for former refugees.
So you picked your hotel according to your background, or yes, maybe just your comfort level, really.
Comfort level. Or probably pocket level as well. It depends on what you could afford.
What was the range? I mean, were there some very expensive ones, or what was the luxury, and what was the the budget basement like?
The Green Park through to some of the very tiny guest houses, which just let out 1 or 2 bedrooms during the summer. Yeah.
Oh, so there was a whole range. Yeah. I mean, how easy was it to come about all these stories? I mean, you got some very rich characters. I mean, did people write about them, or did you have to sort of ferret out people who had these stories in their families?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd ask that question, because this book really benefits from having been written in lockdown. I started writing in March last year at the beginning of lockdown, and I was really, really amazed by, when I put out requests for people to contact me, just the deluge that I had. When I'd been writing previous books based largely on oral history, I sometimes had to negotiate quite hard to get people to agree to let me go and interview them. But because we were in lockdown, people really wanted to talk, and I didn't have to try too hard to get people to come and talk to me. The stories just rolled. The other great thing about lockdown, I don't know about other people, but certainly we spent a lot of time getting into the loft and turning out cupboards and things at the beginning of lockdown. And this was great for me as a historian, because people had at their fingertips lovely photos that they're willing to share with me for the book, and also lots of documents that I might not otherwise have got.
So what was the starting point for the research? Where did you go first?
I think it was twin tracked. There was I did over 120 interviews, I think, in the end, and I was carrying out those over a period of time, and it was a bit of a kind of snowball effect, that once you talk to one person, they say, well, you really need to talk to X, Y, Z. But the other time-consuming piece of research that I did was that I used the Jewish Chronicle archives. I did a search on the word Bournemouth and got over 28,000 hits.
I'll keep you busy for a while then.
And I started by thinking, I can just do some samples, and I can just do kind of, a bit per decade. And I realized I was missing really vital information. And over a period of about 3 months, I did work my way through the 28,000 hits. And I'm really glad that I did, because it was an incredible source of information.
It is. I mean, I know our researchers went to the JC archives, and that was very, very valuable. So in terms of what were the things which struck you first coming out of that research? Was it the people? Was it the establishments? Or just what was it?
Well, I'm a social historian by both training and by inclination. And if anybody reads the book, it's the descriptions are all around people, the people that ran them, the people that worked in them, the people that stayed there. Whenever I've got the material, I really bring out the personalities of people and how they related to each other. Actually, as well as the personalities that you've already asked about, I really try and describe some of the relationships within the hotels, between the hoteliers and the guests, between the different guests, between the guests and Jewish people living in the town, etc. Relationships are really quite important.
And were there any stories which just didn't fit into the book? You really would have, they were fascinating stories, but they weren't quite the Bournemouth story. Were there things like that you came across?
There were lots. I was really surprised with this one. In past books, people are saying, well, I've got this really good story, but I don't want to quote it.
Yes.
I didn't come across that at all in the Bournemouth book. People were really wanting to share their lovely memories and anecdotes. The thing that I haven't mentioned so far, and it's really quite pivotal to this book, is that most of the people who worked in the hotels were non-Jewish. It was about supply and demand, but also for religious reasons, because the hotels needed people who could work on Shabbat. And therefore, there's a huge cohort of people who worked in the hotels at one time and another, and they came with a huge amount of knowledge. And this is the first book that I've written where a lot of the people I interviewed were non-Jewish. And it gives an interesting dimension to a Jewish history book, seeing Jewish history through the eyes of non-Jewish people. When I went to Bournemouth about 6 weeks ago to launch this book, I had talks on 2 days running, and most of the people who came to the talks were not Jewish. And I think that that's probably another legacy of the Jewish hotels, that because of the people who worked them and knew them, it has left a strong, warm feeling amongst the non-Jewish community about Judaism, and knowledge that doesn't exist in other areas.
So it's a positive outcome rather than a negative one. I mean, sometimes you would think sort of like the staff might be, underpaid and overworked and wouldn't come out with a good impression, but you're saying the opposite, really.
The staff in the Jewish hotels were really well paid and they were really well valued. A lot of them stayed there for lots and lots of years and became very well known to the guests. They were, kind of known by name. They were very loyal. They're highly trained staff.
So did they come from or did they learn on the job? Did they come from an experienced background in London, or?
They were mostly trained on the job. And an interesting dimension for people who stayed in the hotels, and I remember, is there were quite a few, a bit later on, people who came to work in the hotels from places like Italy and Spain. Some of the Italian waiters, like Mr. Mimo in Green Park, were just much loved characters, and a lot of them actually stayed behind in Bournemouth after the hotels closed.
Now, you were talking about the benefits of lockdown and that people opened up and they'd already started rooting through their own family papers. Were there any downsides to working in lockdown?
Oh, certainly there were. The first is I worked, because of lockdown, I worked through the telephone to get a lot of my information. It was only as I became a bit more aware that I started to talk to people on Zoom. I hadn't heard of the word Zoom until about last April, May time. And I found it quite challenging to start with, to get that same rapport with people, talking to them on the telephone, that I had previously been able to get by sitting in the same room and interviewing them. it's not the same talking to people remotely. So I had to kind of develop techniques that worked for electronic forms. The other challenge was around the recording of information. When I previously interviewed people, I'd taken with me a recording device, so I had a really good record of what they said, until I realised about Zoom recording. I had to rely quite heavily on my handwritten notes, which were not that great, and as a result I had to go back to people several times to clarify my notes, and also go to other sources to corroborate some of the things that I thought that I'd heard. I suppose the third challenge as well is that I wasn't able to get to a lot of the documents that I would have liked. All the libraries were closed, including the library in Bournemouth. And although the librarian there was really helpful in looking things up for me, I still at the end couldn't get to all the documents I wanted.
I mean, are there a lot of documents still there? I mean, obviously you've not sort of gone out and the book's finished now, but would you have expected there to be a lot of documentation around the hotels and so forth?
Yeah, I'd have liked access to things like the local newspapers, which are not digitized, things like street directories to track establishments and people. But not just Bournemouth. I mean, things like the London Metropolitan Archives, I'd like to have got into the records, the Bet-Din and the Cash Ruse Commission. There must have been some stories to tell about things that might have gone wrong in the Jewish hotels.
Well, we've talked and talked, and now I think it's time for any other questions. There's been quite a lot of comments there. So if there's anybody in the audience who would like to make a point or ask a question, or they've got a family bit of history relating to the hotels in Bournemouth or something like that, just put your hand up. Oh, I can see Joe is straight in there, and unmute yourself. Hi, Joe, morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let's turn up a bit. Is that better?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to tell Pam, I didn't put it in chat. My uncle, Jerry Vandisler, owned the King's Hotel in Brighton, which was kosher. I was the mitzvah there a long time ago, 65 years ago. And it was quite, and he actually sold it when he, I think it opened in around about 1950, something like that. Very popular, did very well.
Yes, I've heard of that hotel. Did you ever go to Bournemouth?
Yeah. Seem to remember. Yeah, I think, yeah. I went with my parents, I think.
I can see a couple more questions around the room. I'll go first to Marion and then to Mavis. So Marion, would you like to? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. And just seen I can get your book on Amazon. So yeah, just a lot of memories. We used to stay as a family at the Green Park, and I mean it's weird what I do remember. I mean, it's very small things, like there were petit fours after little marzipan sweets after dinner. I remember those. And also that there was a pinball machine. There was a sort of like probably a converted garage as a sort of annex. I used to go, and maybe it had table tennis as well. I don't remember. No, I do remember the pinball machine. But no, I had lots of happy, the Marriott family. And I think Mrs. can't remember her name, but she was, truly the matriarch. You were talking about, the women entrepreneurs really running the hotels. She was very much in charge.
Sarah Marriott, she was called, and I had the fortune of actually interviewing several times their daughter, Barbara Glynn.
Oh, wonderful.
Golders Green. And when I did a talk recently in London, she came along, and usually I relay some of the stories that Barbara told me, but she was there to tell them in person, which was lovely.
Fabulous. And there's a film, I saw a film recently, I think specifically about the Green Park.
It's about Green Park, yeah. Yeah.
I can't remember what it's called. Yeah. Anyway,
so
thank you.
good.
That was really fabulous talk, and I look forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion. And Mavis. Good morning, Mavis.
Good morning. When I was 16, I was allowed to go to the Cumberland because that was with a girlfriend, because that was quite all right. I'd be with other Jewish people. And from then on, and you met other youngsters of your own age. And from then on, really until I was married and went through the from the Cumberland to the Majestic to the Green Park, I've got many memories of holidays in Bournemouth. And Schneider at the Majestic, what was her first name? Faye Schneider. She was like an eagle eye. She watched all the young people there, and you couldn't do this and couldn't do that. And you know, she really kept an eye on everybody. I was engaged when I went there, and I went from my hometown, Nottingham, and met my fiance there, who was Portsmouth. And he came up to me and gave me a kiss on the cheek. And she said, "You can't do that. She's engaged." You know, she was like a mother hen. And we said, "It's all right, because we're engaged to each other." But many happy memories, even when my children were little.
Oh, that's fabulous, Mavis.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the talk.
I actually spoke to Faye Schneider's daughter, and she told me some lovely stories about her mother and what a feisty character she was. But she was also quite very charitable as well. She used the hotel to raise a lot of money for charity, particularly a charity called Ravenswood, which people might have heard of.
Yes, I was on the committee of Ravenswood at one time. Yes, yes, indeed.
I can see Avril's waving her hand. Good morning, Avril.
Hi, I bought the book. I have to confess I haven't read it yet, and I'm a friend of Beverly and Stuart.
Yes, you must love the cover, isn't it wonderful?
Wonderful. But the other thing is, she told me that the first print was sold out, and you're on the second reprint now.
Yes, yeah. Almost within a month, all the copies had gone. People were ringing me or emailing and said, "I can't get it on Amazon." And I thought, I was a bit grumpy with the publishers and said, "Why can't people get it?" And I suddenly realized, actually, it's probably quite good publicity for the book to sell out so quickly. You can get it on Amazon and places like Waterstones, etc. But Ed, if people email me, I can actually send copies to people, signed copies. I can sign.
Special edition signed copies.
Signed
copies. Yes, you signed mine, and Beverly signed it as well.
All right, good.
Yeah, yes. But I also stayed in well, I can't remember which hotel it was in Bournemouth, because I just thought, I was coming from Manchester, and I thought, oh, it was some magnificent building. I know we had a nice time, and I remember my husband said he stayed there, and there was just too much food, and he sort of gave up eating some of the meals. But happy memories, and thank you very much for a lovely talk.
Yeah, just two things that sparks, Ed, is that people told me that people went to the hotels kind of from the north of Scotland and all over the northeast and northwest, but that getting to the hotels was sometimes part of the holiday. There was a special train that went from Manchester, the Pines Express. I don't know whether you travelled on that or not. And then for people from London, there was the Bournemouth Bell, and that was all part of the holiday experience. And the other thing that came out in the book was that the hotels tended to be a bit tribal, that people from Manchester might have gone to the Normandy, whereas people from Hull went to the Majestic, etc. And I was quite amused by kind of people gravitating to different hotels.
Well, certainly I remember sort of the talk in the north was always of the Normandy, probably still is actually.
It is.
And I can see Debbie, who's up in Scotland, was busy nodding away when you were talking about journeys from Scotland. Indeed. So have we got any more sort of memories or questions from our lovely audience here today?
Yeah, we went once when I was about 13 or so to the Majestic, and I can remember my Mum tried to sell it to me, telling me it was a children's week. Well, obviously I was a bit too old for children's week, but it was still okay. I remember the food, certainly. Yeah.
Thanks, Sharon. Oh, there's Jerry. Jerry's put a few comments in the chat. Good morning, Jerry.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much, Pam. Love your talk. Bournemouth has got very many special memories for me. We used to stay at the Cumberland very regularly, and I think that due to the increase in staycation, I think that some of these hotels should open up and would do very well. Blumenfeld, bless her, may she forever rest in peace. She used to come to me because I'm vegetarian, and she used to run her hand through my hair and say, "Don't worry, Gerald, worry, Gerald. I've got something special for you in the kitchen." and you know, it was just lovely, and I'd love to be able to go there again with my family, although they're all grown up. I think there'll be special places.
Yeah, the Invern family who worked with related to the Fells were kind enough to loan me 6 discs. Richard Invern had recorded Bloomer talking before she died, and it was just a real privilege to hear her voice talking about how she came from Poland and worked at Feld's restaurant in the East End through to opening up the Cumberland. It's an amazing story in its own right.
Yeah, fantastic.
Pam, were there any more legacies of the hotels? I mean, presumably now, you know, we still hear talk about the Normandy, but I assume most of them have now gone. What are the ones that remain? Are there any small ones that remain?
No, there's no small ones. So there's the Water Garden and the Normandy, as I mentioned, and both of them are very orthodox. The Normandy is mainly open just in the summer for long holidays, but the main holiday trade these days is for Haredi people and for self-catering rather than the hotels.
Yeah.
I understand from people that live in Bournemouth, did somebody say they lived in Bournemouth, is that since COVID, there's really been an upsurge in Jewish people returning to Bournemouth for the holidays as a staycation, and that the price of property is rocketing as a result, which is perhaps a good news story.
Well, of course, now there is a fairly, relative to all the other sort of medium-sized and larger communities around the country, it's quite a substantial community that lives in Bournemouth, and they've got a number of shuls there. And of course, like you say, the Water Garden is Chabad, I think, that runs that. So they have a deli and they have a hotel, and somebody suggested before lockdown, when I was visiting the south of England, that I might like to stay there, but that's yet to happen because of lockdown. So perhaps the legacy is that there is an embedded community there. But I mean, I know people from Southport and Manchester who had moved, who'd retired down to Bournemouth, and so maybe that is the legacy. What do you think?
It is. I made that point about because people stayed in hotels, they actually went to live, when they retired, they went to live in Bournemouth. I don't know whether the figures are the same, but I charted wave after wave of people who went to live in Bournemouth as a result of the hotels.
So you're mentioning that people could get in touch. Are you happy to share your email address, or would you like me to do it the other way around?
No, share the email. I don't know whether you can put
it do you want to put it in the chat, and then people can see it? I can read it out as well. If anybody misses that and they want to get in touch, just email to me, hello@jscn.org.uk, and I can always pass your requests on to Pam. And
I can't think how to put something in the chat.
Well, just if you just read out your email address, and then people can write it down.
So it's Pam Fox at virginmedia.com.
So Pam Fox is all one word, PAMFOX at virginmedia.com. So and if you didn't get that, then just get in touch. You've managed to put it in the chat now. So if you open up your chat window, you'll be able to see that. So thank you so much, Pam. I can see there's one last question, so we can't go without a question from Richard. So good morning, Richard.
Not a question. I do remember when I was about 13, 14, spending 2 or 3 days in Bournemouth. Can't remember which hotel. All I know was there was an elderly lady who was very much in charge. But the last time I was in Bournemouth, Maureen and I stayed at the Cumberland, not kosher.
Not
But,
kosher.
but half the people we met there very much were, including a couple from Edgware who had had their honeymoon there 60 years before.
Yes, lovely. Yeah, it was the thing to do, is if you'd been to a Jewish hotel as a child, you went back for your honeymoon, which was lovely.
Well, thanks, Richard. And thank you all for your questions this morning. And it's fascinating. Personally, I've never, ever been to Bournemouth. We were supposed to go on holiday, but we didn't. My brother and sister did go. And I remember my brother and my sister, I think, I went to a Dusty Springfield concert especially. But that's my own personal memories. But it sounds like a fascinating book, and I can highly recommend. It's a good read, as are all Pam's books. I'm sure you can look them all up on Amazon, or she'll let you know where you can get them if they're not on Amazon anymore. Pam, thank you so much. We've got some more bookshelf authors coming up in the new year, and just keep an eye on the website for that to see all the events, our events, any other events. Go onto our Jewish events calendar. Again, just find it from the front page of Jewish Small Communities Network, jscn.org.uk. And we're back to our regular chat meeting next week and running up until the Christmas holidays. I hope you had a nice Hanukkah. Hanukkah's just finished, and I hope you can weather the storms and they're not going to do anything terrible where you are. So stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you all again very soon. Thank you very much, and lovely thanks again to Pam.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Ed.